Γεια σας και καλώς ήρθατε στο euronews. Το μειωμένο ενδιαφέρον των πολιτών για τις ευρωεκλογές, η άνοδος των δυνάμεων της ακροδεξιάς και το μέλλον της Ουκρανίας αποτελούν βασικές προκλήσεις για την επόμενη Ευρωκάλπη τον Ιούνιο. Για όλα αυτά, αλλά και για τις αμερικανικές εκλογές, συζητούμε με την Γερμανοαμερικανίδα πολιτική αναλύτρια Κάθριν Κλούβερ Άσμπρουκ, που είναι εκτελεστική διευθύντρια του Ιδρύματος Bertelsmann Stiftung. Hello and thank you for joining us. These are the first European elections after the pandemic. These are the first elections after the war in Ukraine, in a very changed world. Which are the main stakes of these EU elections?
Well, I think the main stakes are exactly as you mentioned. What does Europe want to be in a world in which the tectonic shifts around it are of such magnitude? The great power rivalry is a real thing. We feel it every day in terms of our supply chains, in terms of our economic choices, in terms of how we perceive inflation and cost right across the European Union. And of course, our physical security remains threatened because the war in Ukraine is all from clear. The outcome of the war across Ukraine is all from clear. And so you would assume that European voters understand that this is probably the most high-stakes election in the history of the European Union. But then you look at voter participation numbers, and while those tick up, they still seem to be quite low.
The rise of the far right in Europe right now is a cause of concern for many analysts. The far right, though, is very fragmented. Do you think that after the European elections, if they get the seats as projected in the polls right now, they will be able to actually influence European politics?
Well, I think the tricky thing or the pernicious thing with the far right in Europe is that they don't actually have an agenda to push truly, other than the radical things that will never happen, which is to have the European project come apart from the inside. And yet they can do so much by doing nothing. They can do so much by holding up key appointments. In a moment when we'll have more global volatility in November with the US election, they can do so much by curtailing freedom of action for the centrist parties that need to move what is effectively a progressive agenda for Europe, really, again, claiming the stake of Europe's role in a world that's deglobalizing, that's changing. And so that's where I see the greatest potential damage, that they force inaction, that they curtail action just when we need it most.
There are analysts claiming right now that the pro-Ukraine alliance right now in Europe is losing momentum. You said one of the main stakes of these European elections is Ukraine and the end of the war. Do you think there's an actual danger there?
No, I do think that there is a danger of a backsliding, but we also see in the opinion polls that what people want is more Europe. In answering the call of Ukraine. They want European, what we would call communitarization, joint decision making. There's overwhelming support at 87% for common EU defense policy, we find at the Bertelsmann Foundation in our surveys. So if an argument can be made about we will find better solutions together and we will be able to pool and shift and change monies and the way that we think about long-term financing and also in terms of deterrence from an EU side that feeds into a NATO machinery, then those are proactive answers against that backsliding that you mentioned, which we do see in the numbers, indeed.
Why do you think the participation of the citizens in the elections are relatively low?
Well, that's a historical problem. In the analyst circles, we describe it as a democratic deficit. Number one, the fact that voting systems are not the same across all 27 member states or are different than their national voting mechanisms. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there's still a lack of understanding of what the European Union actually does and how it affects your own personal life, so that people see these elections as by-elections to pass judgment on their national governments. They see it as a low-risk move to pass judgment. And that's part of the pull of the far right in the European elections. I would not overstate the numbers that we'll see in a European election in terms of the movement to the far right to what we might see in national elections. I would not generalize there. That is a very, very specific thing that's country by country.
Why do you think after so many decades of existence of the European Union there is a failure for people to understand what is the impact of the decision made in Brussels in their everyday life?
Well,
discuss this, the low participation in every EU election, and then in the next one, and then in the next one, and we always have the same discussion.
Well, I think the easy answer is our governments need to get out of the way, which is to say our governments will happily claim the victories that are made in Brussels. They will hide the fact that they have pooled sovereignty, that they have given some own decision-making away. But they need to be telling the citizens, look, this comes from Brussels with our help. We co-negotiated this. This needs a whole flip of the narrative. But, you know, where do Europeans feel it? They feel it in the fact that all of their IT plugs are now the same. They feel it with, you know, their banking system. They feel it in their cell phone mobility. They feel it in very distinct things that have sped up. And that narrative needs to be made both about the practical assistance that the EU has delivered to average European lives, but also on the larger scale. And European heads of state need to be doing more of that message delivery for Brussels, speaking for Brussels, with Brussels, rather than trying to claim, quote-unquote, victories from Brussels for themselves.
Apart from the European elections, we have US elections coming up in a few months. Which are the possible scenarios after the US elections for the aid in Ukraine that is highly anticipated in Ukraine, and for the position of the US in the Ukrainian war in general?
Well, I think those are really the big questions of the moment right now. It's about the credibility of the United States. It's about the competence of the United States on the international stage. And you see a Republican Party that has decided to take the stake of the free country of Ukraine in its own hands and try to make domestic gains on it. And it's frankly irresponsible governance. But what are the likely scenarios? Could be likely if the Republicans take the Senate, the Congress goes to the Democrats, and there's a Republican in the White House, that aid and financial support end almost immediately. Donald Trump has said that he wants to end the war in Ukraine on day one, and that can only happen by pulling back that kind of support, which puts the onus on the Europeans, and again, which makes this vote so critical that's coming up in June. But I think it will send a very dangerous signal to the autocratic alliance that's forming across the world. China, Russia, Iran, they are on the rise. They're causing havoc and chaos right across the world. The United States, as the beacon, the shining city on the hill, cannot be signaling to the world that it's effectively lights off in Washington, that they're retreating behind the water's edge. But that is certainly the agenda of Donald Trump, and it will make the world much more volatile, much more dangerous, and certainly for Europe, its citizens, and the European Union, the construct on the whole, it will endanger its economic prosperity and, of course, its physical security. So this is a moment in time where Europe needs to step up, make critical decisions, stand at the ready, because truly we will see a weakened NATO from the U.S. side if Donald Trump is president. The flip side is the case if Joe Biden moves into the White House. So you see these next moments, these next 7 months and then in the European election, then from June to November, 5 months. those are critical moments for the Western alliance and for the ways in which we have conducted our lives for almost 80 years.
Thank you very much for this discussion.